The Harvard auditorium erupted in applause as Professor Christopher Brown stepped up to the podium, his eyes gleaming with confidence. Known for his sharp-witted speeches that often ridiculed faith, particularly Christianity, he was in his element. But today he wasn't facing a naive student. Seated in the audience was Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary. She smiled quietly, prepared for the intellectual battle ahead. As murmurs filled the packed auditorium, Professor Brown adjusted his glasses, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let's get straight to the point," he began, scanning the crowd before letting his gaze settle on Karoline. "Research shows that intelligent people are less likely to believe in fanciful notions." He paused, then added with a sardonic smile, "But sometimes family traditions make it difficult for people to embrace intellectual growth." A hush fell over the room as he tapped the microphone lightly. "Today," he continued, his voice low and dramatic, "we celebrate reason, science, and truth, the forces that have pulled humanity out of the darkness of superstition." His eyes flickered toward Karoline, his expression laced with provocation. But sadly, not everyone keeps up with that progress. Behind him, the large screen lit up, displaying a graph, a downward curve illustrating an inverse relationship between intelligence and religious belief. "Look at this," he said triumphantly, pointing at the chart. "As intelligence and education rise, belief in supernatural tales, like some sky god sitting on clouds, declines. Astonishing, isn't it?" His tone dripped with condescension. "Or, should I simplify it further?" he added, smirking. "For those who still think God wrote the U.S. Constitution?" Chuckles rippled through the audience, a few students clapping while others stole glances at Karoline, waiting for her reaction. She remained still, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I must say I'm surprised," Christopher continued, pacing the stage like an actor in his element. "We have some of America's brightest minds here, the future of science, politics, and philosophy, and yet some still cling to these primitive beliefs." He turned sharply to Karoline, his gaze piercing. "Miss Leavitt, aren't you the mouthpiece for this so-called Make America Great Again movement? I suppose your faith is part of that, a fairy tale to lull the masses?" Laughter erupted, and a journalist in the front row scribbled furiously, sensing a headline in the making. Christopher raised a hand to quiet the crowd before pressing on, his tone growing sharper. "Let me quote Richard Dawkins," he declared. "Religion is a delusion, a virus of the mind. And you, Miss Leavitt, seem the perfect host, a conservative, a believer, a puppet of the president in an age of reason." His arms crossed, his smirk widening. "So tell us, what justification do you have for this so-called faith of yours? Or are you just here to parrot empty White House slogans?" A few students shifted uncomfortably, sensing he had gone too far. In the back row, Professor Henry Wallace, a longtime colleague, watched with concern. Christopher loved to provoke, but this personal edge could backfire. At the podium, Christopher cast one last glance at Karoline, daring her to falter. But instead of shrinking, she stood. The faint scrape of her chair against the wooden floor echoed in the silent hall. All eyes turned to her as she stepped onto the stage. "Professor Christopher," she began, her voice clear and composed, "I'd be delighted to address your question and your assumptions." She paused, locking eyes with him, a faint smile on her lips. "You pride yourself on scientific thinking," she continued, "but it's ironic that you start with the assumption that belief in God equates to a lack of intelligence. That's not objective reasoning, Professor, that's prejudice, dressed up as rationality." A heavy silence settled over the room. Christopher's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it, folding his arms again. Karoline didn't give him a chance to interrupt. "If you truly valued science," she said, her voice steady but sharp, "you'd know this. Some of history's greatest minds, Isaac Newton, Max Planck, Albert Einstein, acknowledged a higher power. Newton wrote more about God than physics. Einstein said, 'Science without religion is lame.' Were they fools, Professor? Or are you just cherry-picking evidence to fit your narrative?" A few students nodded, while others turned to Christopher. Waiting for his response, he scoffed. You're dragging out dusty old names to justify yourself, Miss Leavitt. They lived in the Dark Ages, before modern science enlightened us. Karoline tilted her head, amusement flickering in her eyes. Karoline took a step forward, her gaze unwavering, her voice steady. What about Francis Collins, the man who led the Human Genome Project? A devout Christian. Is he outdated too, Professor? Or do you simply dismiss anything that doesn't fit your preconceptions? The room fell still. Christopher's fingers drummed an uneasy rhythm on the podium's edge. Oh, you think you can outsmart me, Miss Leavitt? He snapped, his tone sharp. This isn't a White House press briefing. A few laughs rippled through the audience. No, Karoline replied coolly. This is supposed to be a place where reason and truth are honored. But instead you've turned it into a stage for mockery, not debate. She turned to the audience, her eyes scanning their faces. I'm not here to preach. I'm here to ask, if faith is truly a sign of weakness, why has Professor Christopher spent his career attacking it? Her gaze flicked back to him, a faint smile forming. Or perhaps it's you who is afraid of something? Christopher opened his mouth, but no words came. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. For the first time, he looked rattled. His hands clenched the podium, his usual smirk faltering. The silence stretched. Then he cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. Miss Leavitt, he said, his voice a little too high. Do you really think tossing out a few historical names justifies outdated beliefs? We live in an age of science, evolution, quantum physics, artificial intelligence. Your faith has no place in the modern world. Karoline remained unfazed. She lifted the microphone, her eyes locked onto his. Professor, she said with quiet confidence, you just praised modern science, so let me ask you this. If you truly believe in reason and evidence, why commit a basic statistical error? In your argument? She gestured toward the large screen behind him, the same graph he had triumphantly displayed earlier. You claim high IQ leads to less belief in God, she continued. But correlation doesn't equal causation. Even a freshman would spot that. In all your years of research, did you overlook this fundamental principle? A few chuckles and nods of agreement spread through the audience. Christopher flushed. His fingers tightened on the podium. Don't try to play clever with me, he snapped, his voice laced with frustration. This graph isn't my opinion. It's based on dozens of real data studies, not your feelings, not blind faith. Science has proven that as humans advance, they shed superstitions like Christianity. Karoline tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Real data, you say? A touch of amusement laced her words. Then why not mention studies showing that religious belief often correlates with higher mental resilience, stronger communities, and better mental health? She took another step forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Or do you only cite data that fits your narrative and ignore the rest? She let the question hang in the air before delivering the final blow. That's not science, Professor. That's propaganda. The room erupted. In one corner, a group of students cheered. Journalists in the front row scribbled furiously. Christopher raised a hand, trying to regain control, but his face was flushed, sweat beading on his forehead. You're twisting the issue, he barked, his composure slipping. Things like resilience or community don't prove God exists. They're just byproducts of human psychology, chemical reactions in the brain, nothing more. Love, justice, morality, they're just evolutionary mechanisms to serve humanity. You can't use them to justify an imaginary sky god. Karoline remained still, unshaken. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm but razor-sharp. If justice is just a chemical reaction in the brain, she asked, then why do you still believe in it, Professor? The question cut through the noise like a blade. If everything is just biology, why do you fight for fairness in academia? Why get angry when challenged if it's all just reflexes? She let the silence stretch before delivering the final strike. If what you say is true, then this entire debate is meaningless, and you know it. She turned to the audience, her voice rising like a wake-up call. Justice, love, meaning, these aren't mere chemical reactions. They're the foundations that shape human society. Faith doesn't oppose reason. It opens doors to truths beyond the limits of pure science. The applause swelled, louder than before. A few students stood clapping while Christopher stepped back, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "You're off topic," he growled, trying to regain the upper hand. But the momentum had already shifted. Christopher leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Science, Miss Leavitt, not empty philosophical platitudes. Quantum physics proves the universe operates without any divine hand. Evolution explains life's origins without needing Adam and Eve myths. So tell me, what's your counter-argument?" Karoline took a steady breath, her eyes burning with the resolve of someone who had weathered public firestorms. Years in the political arena, criticism, hit pieces, relentless scrutiny, had only sharpened her. She met Christopher's gaze without hesitation. "Quantum physics, you say?" She raised an eyebrow. "You're right. It's shown us the universe is far stranger than we ever imagined. But perhaps you've heard of physicists like John Polkinghorne, a Christian, who used it to explore deeper truths." She let the statement linger before continuing, her tone sharper now. "And evolution, it explains mechanisms, not origins. So tell me, Professor, where did life begin? A random chemical reaction?" She took a step forward. "If you believe that without definitive proof, aren't you also putting faith in something unproven?" Christopher opened his mouth to reply, but Karoline didn't give him the chance. She pressed on, her voice cutting through the charged silence. "Let me ask you this, Professor." Her eyes locked onto his. "Where does consciousness come from? Not just emotions or reflexes, but the ability to think, to reflect, to question, like we are doing right now. Science still can't fully explain it. So how do you?" She paused, then added, "Or are you only good at mocking what you can't answer?" A flicker of unease crossed Christopher's face. His fingers tightened around the podium. "Consciousness," he stammered, his voice strained, "is a product of the brain, a result of billions of years of evolution. We don't fully understand it yet, but we will. And without God." His voice pitched higher, less confident, as if he were trying to reassure himself more than the audience. Karoline tilted her head, her smile no longer patient but razor-sharp. "Not fully understood, you say?" A note of mockery crept into her tone. "So you admit science has gaps, questions without answers, yet instead of considering something beyond our grasp, you rush to insist there is nothing." Her eyes glinted. "That's not reason, Professor. That's prejudice in a lab coat." The thunderous applause wasn't scattered this time. It was unified, powerful. A group of students leapt to their feet cheering. Others exchanged glances, their former admiration for Christopher giving way to doubt. Christopher raised a trembling hand, trying to regain control. You're twisting my argument," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Science doesn't need gaps to shove God into. We've moved past that era. You're just another backward conservative clinging to delusions to prop up political power." Karoline didn't flinch. She took another step forward, her voice ringing out like a declaration of truth. "I'm not here to defend power, Professor." Her eyes burned with conviction. "I'm here to defend truth." She let the words settle, before continuing, her voice unwavering. "You claim science has surpassed faith, but you forget. Faith inspired history's greatest minds. You mock me as a conservative, yet you're the one clinging to the illusion that you have all the answers, even when you can't address humanity's biggest questions." Christopher gripped the podium tighter, his knuckles white. His anger had faded, replaced by something else. Uncertainty. You're trying to distract," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Science has given us answers. Not all, but enough to know that God isn't necessary." He pointed a shaking finger at Karoline, but the gesture lacked force. Karoline inhaled deeply, then stepped forward once more, slow and deliberate, each step underscoring the gravity of what she was about to say. Her voice was calm, razor-sharp. "Enough to know, Professor?" A flicker of irony touched her lips. "Then give this audience a real answer." She turned, her gaze sweeping the crowd before locking onto Christopher once more. "Where does consciousness come from? Not just chemical reactions, not just brain impulses, but the ability to perceive, to think, to question, like this very debate. Can your science fully explain it? Christopher shifted uncomfortably. And one more question, she continued. Where did life begin? Evolution is a process, not an origin. Did life emerge from a random chemical reaction in some primordial ocean? Do you have solid, indisputable proof? Or do you simply accept that hypothesis because you refuse to consider another possibility? She let the question hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. And if there's no evidence, she added, her voice softer but more piercing than ever, isn't your belief in spontaneous life just another form of faith? Christopher opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His fingers trembled against the wooden edge of the podium. Slowly, he lowered his gaze, his once commanding presence unraveling before the audience's eyes. That's a question yet to be answered, he stammered, his voice barely audible. But the moment had already passed. The power had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. Christopher's voice, once filled with certainty, now wavered. Science will find the answers, he muttered, though his confidence had thinned. Sooner or later, we won't need to rely on fairy tales. Karoline's smile hardened. Yet to be answered, she echoed, her tone unwavering. Then let me ask you one final question, Professor. She took a deliberate step forward, her voice cutting through the thick silence. This universe, with all its physical constants perfectly tuned for life, where did it come from? If just one number were slightly off, we wouldn't be here. How do you explain that fine-tuning? She let the question settle before pressing on. Random chance? The odds of that happening by accident are lower than finding a single grain of sand hidden somewhere on Earth. So tell me, Professor, do you truly believe in pure randomness, or do you have another explanation? The auditorium fell deathly silent. Christopher stood motionless. His hands dropped from the podium. His gaze was vacant, as if confronting a truth he dared not acknowledge. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. A bead of sweat traced down his temple. For the first time in his career, he did not look like a learned scholar. He looked cornered. Karoline took another step forward. Her voice, sharp as a verdict, rang through the hall. You can't answer, Professor. She held his gaze. And do you know why? She let the silence stretch, her words striking with precision. Because you don't just mock faith, you fear it. You fear that the gaps in science aren't just unanswered questions, but signs of something beyond human understanding. You fear that a lifetime spent denying might rest on a flawed belief. Her gaze softened, though her conviction remained unshaken. I don't deny science, she continued. On the contrary, I cherish it. Science allows us to explore the beauty and wonder of the universe. But when you claim there's nothing beyond the material world, that's not a conclusion based on evidence. It's an assumption rooted in bias. She let her words settle before delivering the final blow. You can't prove God doesn't exist because science can't definitively prove a negative. So where does your certainty come from, Professor? Reason, or the very arrogance you accuse, the faithful of having? She exhaled slowly, her voice carrying the weight of something undeniable. And here's the last thing I'll say. The entire auditorium hung on her words. Faith doesn't oppose intellect, it's its companion. When science reaches its limits, faith keeps asking questions. When data runs dry, faith seeks meaning. You mock it, but you can't answer the questions it raises. She let her final words strike like an undeniable truth. So tell me, Professor, who's really afraid here? Christopher stood frozen. His hands hung limp. His eyes, once blazing with authority, now looked hollow, vacant. Then the room erupted. Applause, cheers, an undeniable shift in the air. Not just support. Not just admiration. Something irreversible. Dozens of students shot to their feet, their gazes locked onto Karoline with open respect. Some exchanged glances, murmuring in awe. A student in the back whispered, voice tinged with disbelief, "She just took down Christopher." No one's ever done that, another replied, shaking his head in astonishment. In a quiet corner, a small group leaned in, their whispers urgent. He couldn't answer. Not a single thing. At the front, a journalist's pen raced across the page, eyes gleaming at the headline unfolding before them. A camera lens focused on Karoline, capturing the moment, one that would echo far beyond this debate. Christopher swallowed hard, his throat dry. He cleared it, grasping at the last shreds of control. We should move on, he muttered weakly, his trembling hand half raising as if to silence the crowd. No one listened. His voice trailed off, unheard. No, one cared. Every eye remained on Karoline, still standing, microphone in hand. Calm, resolute. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply stood there, letting the truth speak for itself. From the back row, Professor Henry Wallace, Christopher's longtime colleague, slowly rose. Concern and resignation flickered across his face as he hurried down the aisle. Perhaps we should return to the main agenda, he suggested, his voice cutting through the lingering buzz. There's still much to discuss today. His gaze flicked toward Christopher, a silent plea for him to regain his composure. But Christopher didn't respond. He just stood there, hands shaking as he adjusted his glasses, eyes empty, as though the foundation of everything he'd believed had just cracked beneath him. The audience, however, had already moved on. The applause had faded into murmurs, excitement, whispered questions, a palpable shift in perspective. A student in the crowd raised their phone, recording the moment. Karoline stepped off the stage. As she made her way back to her seat, heads turned. Eyes followed. And somewhere, in the hum of conversations and the rustle of papers, one unspoken truth settled over the room. Nothing, after today, would be the same. Nearby students leaned in, whispering in awe. "You were incredible," one murmured, voice trembling with excitement. Karoline offered a faint smile, nodding in thanks but saying nothing more. She didn't need to. The room had spoken for her. Across the hall, Christopher sat in stunned silence, his gaze fixed on the big screen, where his once proud graph still glowed, now a mockery of his former certainty. He cleared his throat, desperate to reclaim control. As I was saying, he began, but his voice wavered. Science shows. No one listened. The murmurs of the audience drowned him out, their attention slipping away, their reverence fading. For the first time in his career, Christopher felt something foreign and suffocating, utter helplessness. He had lost, not just to Karoline but to the room. Once these students had hung on his every word. Now their whispers carried a different name. Professor Christopher lingered behind the podium, shuffling his papers with trembling hands. His gaze avoided the crowd, who now buzzed not about his lecture, but about Karoline Leavitt. His lecture, stumbled on awkwardly, his voice faltering, disjointed. But no one was taking notes. Instead, they whispered among themselves, eyes bright with excitement. "She just did what no one dared," a student said in amazement. Christopher was always unbeatable, until today. In the audience, Karoline had gone from an anonymous guest to the center of attention. When the conference paused, a cluster of students swarmed her, their voices eager and curious. "Where did you learn to debate like that?" one asked, thrilled. "How did you stay so calm when he attacked you?" Another chimed in. Karoline smiled lightly. "I just said what I believe is true." Her humility did nothing to dim her magnetism. Nearby, a student raised their phone, recording a brief interview. A journalist typed frantically, sending a message to their editor. White House press secretary takes down Harvard professor. Huge. Headline incoming. Word spread fast. Within minutes, clips from the debate flooded social media. An ex-post read, "Karoline Leavitt just silenced Professor Christopher. Watch now." Below it, a video of her dismantling his arguments on consciousness and life's origins racked up thousands of views by the second. The comments exploded. "She's unreal. Christopher just got crushed. Debate of the year. In the dim corner of the now emptying hall, Christopher sat alone, his hands cradling his head. The conference had ended, but the debate's echo lingered. His once prized notes lay scattered. Before him, meaningless relics of a battle lost. The screen before him had gone dark, but Karoline's words still rang in his head. Where does consciousness come from? How did life begin? For years he had believed he held all the answers. Now, for the first time, he felt small before the unknown. Outside the hall, Karoline stepped into the sunlight, the afternoon glow softly illuminating her face. A few students trailed behind, thanking her for speaking up. She nodded, her gaze steady, her presence unshaken. She didn't know it yet, but this wouldn't be the end of the story. It would spread. It would inspire. It would challenge old biases. She walked slowly through the ancient stone corridor, then paused. Ahead of her, standing alone, was Professor Christopher. He clutched a messy stack of papers, his posture no longer proud but weary. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. Not with defiance, but with something else. A deep, quiet pensiveness. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, in a voice tinged with fatigue, but also honesty, he said, "You know, Miss Leavitt, in my entire career, no one has made me rethink things like you did today." Karoline regarded him, her gaze steady. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply replied, her voice calm yet profound. "Sometimes, Professor, those who try hardest to destroy faith end up strengthening it the most." She gave a small, knowing nod, a farewell gesture, then turned away. Her steps were steady as she disappeared into the fading afternoon light. Christopher watched her go, his hand tightening slightly around his papers. His mind, once unshaken, now churned with unfamiliar thoughts. The story didn't end. There, the debate video swept across social media, surging from X to YouTube, racking up millions of views within hours. The comments poured in. Karoline Leavitt is a legend. Christopher met his match. But beyond the personal victory, something bigger had ignited, a conversation. A challenge to long-held assumptions. Karoline hadn't just won a debate, she had sparked a dialogue, and thousands had joined in. Back in the now empty hall, Christopher sat alone. His notes lay scattered. His hands trembled slightly, but more than that, his certainty trembled too. The auditorium, once alive with debate and applause, now held only silence, a silence more daunting than any ovation or murmur. A deep sigh escaped Christopher's chest, as if the ordeal had drained every ounce of his energy. His trembling hand reached out, brushing over the scattered papers before him, papers now rendered meaningless. Graphs, equations, scientific citations, once his unshakable bedrock, offered him no comfort. He thought back to every question Karoline had asked, every razor-sharp rebuttal, and that steady, unwavering gaze. He had expected a dreamer, a blind zealot incapable of reason. Instead, he had faced an opponent not just intelligent but poised, piercing. Consciousness. Life. The universe's fine-tuning, he muttered, as if grasping for anything to restore his shaken certainty. But for the first time, the arguments he had trusted implicitly failed to convince even himself. The answers he had, repeated for years, the ones he had wielded so confidently, now rang hollow. He didn't reject science. He had devoted his life to it. But perhaps his mistake had been assuming science was the whole truth. Leaning back, he closed his eyes, recalling his younger days, when he had been a passionate student, thrilled by the pursuit of the unknown. Back then, questions had excited him. The mystery had been a challenge, not a threat. But somewhere along the way, the pursuit of knowledge had turned into the pursuit of prestige. In academia, reputation outranked truth. He had learned to scoff at anything beyond material evidence, to see faith as a weakness, a crutch for those unwilling to face the universe's randomness. "Maybe," he whispered, as if afraid of his own thoughts. maybe the closed-minded ones, aren't the believers but those who mock them. The idea made him shudder. It contradicted everything he had built his career upon. And yet, he couldn't deny it. He had spent years refusing to question. Not because the answers weren't there, but because they didn't fit within his worldview. Karoline hadn't proven God's existence. She didn't need to. She had only asked the questions he couldn't answer. Questions he had never truly dared to face. Could I be wrong? He let out a bitter laugh. It was such a simple question. And yet for someone like him whose entire identity rested on intellectual certainty, it was a terrifying one. If he was wrong, what did that mean for everything he had taught? Everything he had written? Everything he had fought for? But if he wasn't willing to reconsider, was he truly an honest thinker? He looked down at his hands, once steady as they held lectures, signed research papers, and debated challengers. Now they trembled, not from defeat, but from something deeper. A fear far greater than losing an argument. The fear of facing his own arrogance. For years he had crushed opponents with cold logic, taking pride in dismantling their beliefs. But this time, he felt no victory. He felt empty. Because truth wasn't just what experiments could measure or equations could prove. Perhaps it also lay in what science had not yet touched. And realizing that didn't mean betraying science. It meant being truer to himself. He didn't need to instantly believe in God, but he could admit, finally, honestly, that he didn't have all the answers, and more importantly, he could start listening instead of mocking. Taking a deep breath, he stood. From the dim corner of the hall, he saw light streaming through the glass doors, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to cling to a rigid stance. For the first time in years, he felt relief, because now he was ready to ask questions, and perhaps that was the real beginning of knowledge. The bigger picture. This story is a powerful reminder that intellect and faith are not enemies. They are companions in the search for truth. Karoline Leavitt, with her calm yet cutting arguments, proved that standing firm in one's beliefs, whether before a challenging audience or the world, can shift the conversation. This wasn't just a debate. It was proof that when arrogance meets truth, truth always prevails. If this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Start a conversation. Let the message spread. And if you believe that faith and reason can coexist, subscribe for more deep discussions like this, because truth deserves to be heard, and you can help make that happen.